Welcome back. How long have you been watching my channel? Let me know below.
I knew I shouldn't have come. The second I stepped into Dad's dining room and saw the same fake tulip centerpiece from 2 Easters ago, I felt it in my gut. That slow-burning churn behind the ribs. The kind of ache that's not about nerves, but memory. Everyone was already seated except for me, and they'd clearly been talking without me. The kind of half-hushed talk that dries up the second your shoes hit the floorboards. Dad stood up too quick, arms out in a performative way that said family more than it said Carla. His hug was brief, and his aftershave, some old drugstore bottle I hadn't smelled since 2011, almost made my eyes water. He muttered something about being glad I could make it, like I was a guest. Not the daughter who used to cook Easter ham with Mom back when things were still good. Or at least less broken. Emily didn't get up. She stayed in her chair, one hand draped casually over her new husband's arm, the other cradling her baby bump in that passive-aggressive way that screamed, "Look how fertile and whole I am." She smiled, all teeth, and I swear if someone had snapped a picture in that moment, it would have looked like an ad for a generic antidepressant. The food was already plated. I noticed that mine had slightly less than everyone else's. No deviled eggs, no rolls. Just a quiet way of saying, you came late, you live messy, you get what's left. That was the thing with my family. They never yelled. They judged you with side dishes and prayer requests. We all sat. Forks clinked. The blessing was said. Dad's voice cracked a little when he mentioned Mom, and for a second, I almost felt the past poke through, that tiny thread of shared grief. But then he looked at Emily the way he used to look at Mom, like she was the center of the table, and just like that, I was an orphan again. I was 2 sips into my wine, cheap Chardonnay, served warm, like a punishment, when Dad dropped it. No build-up, no warning. "Your sister's building a new life," he said, his voice loud enough to stop all chewing. "Maybe you should try that too." I didn't answer right away. I let the words sit there like spoiled eggs in the sun. I looked at Emily. She was still smiling. Her husband, Jason, had that look guys get when they know they're in someone else's family fight and just want to disappear into the mashed potatoes. The baby bump got another loving pat, as if to say, "See, Carla, I win again." I lifted my glass. The wine had that metallic aftertaste that sticks to your teeth and your pride. I held it up like a toast, looked my father dead in the eye, and said, "I did. I just didn't invite anyone who gave up on me." And just like that, the room died. No one breathed. Forks hung in the air. Even the baby kicked, I swear to God, like it was trying to exit the situation early. The silence wasn't just quiet, it was suffocating. The kind of silence that builds a second skin over your bones. The kind that tells you there's no going back. Dad set down his fork like he was trying not to stab the table. Emily stared at me like I'd spit in the holy water. Her husband shifted in his seat. No one knew what to say. Because they all knew, every single one of them. They knew I had been trying to rebuild my life for the last 5 years, after the divorce, after the business failure, after the breakdown. They knew, and not one of them showed up. Not to the court hearings, not to the hospital, not to the gallery opening I poured 2 years into. They knew, and they stayed away. That's the thing that burns the most. Not the betrayal, not even the loneliness. It's that when you finally claw your way out of the pit, your own damn family stands at the edge and tells you it's not the right kind of climb. They want the version of you that makes them comfortable, not the one that came back bruised but breathing. I looked around that table, plastic flowers, paper napkins folded like we were kids again, the Jesus cross above the door, slightly tilted like it had given up too. And I realized something. I wasn't supposed to win. I was supposed to stay broken. That's the role they picked for me after Mom died. Emily became the saint. I became the cautionary tale. There's a reason I don't come to these things. And it's not because I hate ham. I didn't say another word for the rest of that meal. They went on like nothing happened. Talked about baby names, real estate, Emily's maternity leave. But they kept looking at me from the side, like I was a grenade with the pin halfway out. I finished my wine, then another. My glass never refilled from the bottle on the table. I had to get up, walk to the kitchen, pour it myself. Another little message, another little dig, but I stayed, just long enough to make them sit in it. And I noticed something in that silence, right after I said it, something that hooked itself into the back of my mind and wouldn't let go. When I said they gave up on me, Dad didn't look angry, Emily didn't look offended, they looked scared. And that scared me, because what the hell were they afraid I might say next? There's a smell that sticks to your memory when you're a kid, and something big is ending. For me, it was that sickly sweet mix of pine sol and panic that clung to the Sunday dress I wore the day we buried my mother. I was 11 years old, and I remember every itchy seam of that too-tight lavender monstrosity. I remember how Emily's dress was the same one she wore for Christmas the year before, and I remember how Dad's tie was crooked, and he didn't care. Most of all, I remember the way the grown-ups whispered not about the woman we lost, but about the way she died. So sudden and so young, just collapsed. Was it her heart? All said in that sideways kind of concern that's really just gossip, dressed up in a black veil. The official word was aneurysm, fast and fatal. 1 minute she was making lunch, the next she was gone. But even as a child, I could feel something wasn't right. Mom didn't just collapse, she unraveled. I'd seen it for months. The shaking hands, the locked bathroom doors, the nights when she'd sit in the car in the garage, long after the engine had stopped. She would come home from work and go straight to the laundry room, staying in there with the door shut for hours. Like that tiny space was the only place she could breathe. Nobody talked about it. Emily pretended not to notice. Dad buried himself in baseball games and bills, and I started asking questions. And that was when everything changed. After Mom died, it was like I got quietly recategorized in the family filing system. I wasn't just Carla. I became the difficult one, the dramatic one, the one who didn't know when to shut up. I was still expected to come to church and smile during photos and say thank you when people brought casseroles I wouldn't eat. But there was a new edge in the way people looked at me, like I reminded them of something they wanted to forget. Emily, on the other hand, seemed to grow into a halo overnight. She became the perfect daughter. She kept her hair neat, her voice quiet, her face clean of all emotion except sweetness. I wanted to scream most days, but instead I started drawing. I would sit for hours with whatever paper I could find, receipts, napkins, the backs of church bulletins, sketching out anything that made sense to me. One time I drew a picture of a house split down the middle, half light, half dark. My 5th grade art teacher called my dad and told him I had creative promise. He said thank you, then threw the picture away. There's a line between silence and survival, and in our house, silence always won. I think the rot started long before Mom died. I just didn't have the words for it yet. I do now. Dad never raised a hand to us, not once. But there were other kinds of violence. The way he'd answer a question with a look that made you feel stupid for asking. The way he'd leave the room when you cried, as if emotion was something contagious and disgusting. The way he'd praise Emily for being level-headed, while sighing at me for being too much. He didn't need to hit us to hurt us. He just slowly made us choose, be quiet and loved, or loud and alone. Emily made her choice fast. I didn't. I kept pushing, kept asking, kept remembering, and that made me dangerous. One day, maybe 6 months after the funeral, I came home from school early, after throwing up in the cafeteria. I walked in the front door and heard voices coming from the laundry room. I froze. Dad was in there talking to someone. Not on the phone, in person, a man. The voice sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it. I leaned closer, heart pounding. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but I heard my name. And then Mom's, and then something that stopped my breath cold. Just make sure the girls don't find out. The door creaked. Dad came out and saw me. I must have looked like a ghost. His face went blank, then dark. What did you hear? Nothing, I said, because I knew how this went. He studied me for a long second, then put his hand on my shoulder in this performative way that made me shiver. Go lie down. "You look pale." I did, and I never spoke of it again. Not until years later, when I told Emily about it, and she told me I was probably dreaming, that I'd always been the dramatic one, that I should stop stirring up ghosts. I laughed it off, but inside I knew something rotten was buried under the foundation of our family, and it was starting to seep up through the cracks. At Easter lunch, when Emily smirked at me like I was a failure she could pet like a stray, I saw the same look in her eyes she used to give me in high school when I'd cry over Mom's perfume disappearing from the hallway closet. The look of someone who'd already forgotten, or chosen to. But the thing about rot is that it doesn't stay hidden forever. Eventually, it starts to smell, and I was getting real tired of being the only one willing to name the stench. There's a strange thing that happens when one sibling is labeled the good one and the other is cast, quietly but irrevocably, as the problem. It doesn't matter how subtle the messaging is, how calm the tones are when it's delivered, or how many birthday cards still arrive on time with "Love, Dad" scrawled neatly in the corner. The roles get cemented in everything. The seating arrangements at holidays, the frequency of phone calls, the unspoken expectations of who'll sacrifice and who'll be celebrated. Emily was born into her role with the ease of someone who never had to ask for permission to be liked. I, on the other hand, was always the disruption, the static in their neat little family radio broadcast. The one who made things uncomfortable by simply refusing to shut up and smile on cue. It was after college when the divide became irreversible. Emily went to work for a real estate firm, straight out of school, married a finance guy by 27, and posted engagement photos where she looked like an airbrushed angel, all soft filters and edited smiles. I was living in a converted garage apartment, bartending at night and painting during the day, selling the occasional piece but mostly making just enough to stay one step ahead of rent. Dad would call her every Sunday. Sometimes I'd catch snippets if I visited and left my coat in the hallway, and their conversations were always about Emily's clients, Emily's promotions, Emily's clean and upward-moving life. Mine, when they happened, were clipped, vague, with long silences that I had to fill. Once I told him I'd sold a piece to a gallery in Austin, and he responded with, "Well, maybe you'll find something full-time soon," as if nothing real could come from me unless it came with health insurance. When Emily's first marriage fell apart, quiet divorce, no drama, just a polite Facebook status change, and a new last name dropped like a dead leaf, I called her. I thought maybe that would be the moment we found each other again, both a little cracked, both less polished than Dad needed us to be. But she never picked up, never called back. It wasn't until 6 months later that I learned from a family friend she'd gotten engaged again, this time to Jason, the clean-shaven, suburban-souled man I had met twice and already forgotten. They got married in Martha's Vineyard. I wasn't invited. I found out about it from an Instagram post with a Bible verse as the caption and a series of perfectly filtered photos that looked more like an ad for lifestyle branding than a wedding. I stared at the screen for a long time that day, sitting in my one-room studio with paint-stained floors, wondering if I was meant to feel jealous or just invisible. By the time Easter lunch came around, she was 6 months pregnant and glowing in that way people mean when they say she's doing everything right. She wore white, of course, tight-fitting but elegant, and her hair was in that kind of loose wave that looks effortless but takes 45 minutes and 2 products to achieve. Jason was at her side like a well-trained Labrador, saying little, nodding when appropriate, and mostly just existing as a prop in her curated life. She smiled at me across the table like we were old friends reunited after years apart, not two sisters who hadn't exchanged more than 10 words in 5 years. I smiled back because I've learned how to do that too. My face knows how to lie even when my stomach is twisting. We had one real conversation before things exploded. It was after Dad had stepped outside to take a call and Jason had wandered off to the bathroom. Emily sat across from me with her hands folded over her stomach, sipping something non-alcoholic out of a wine glass to make it look festive. She leaned in just slightly, tilted her head like a therapist, about to deliver hard news with soft eyes, and said, "You know, I really think you'd be happier if you let go of the past." It wasn't even said with malice. That's the part that got me. She genuinely believed she was helping, as if my history was just an old coat I was too stubborn to throw out, instead of the only thing that ever made sense when everything else felt like gaslighting. I looked at her, really looked at her, and I could see it. The cracks under the polish. There was fear behind her eyes, a tightness in her jaw, something barely holding together beneath the careful calm. I wondered then how much of her life was real and how much was performance. How many lies she'd swallowed in exchange for applause. So I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I just said, "Funny how you think it's the past when it's still happening." She blinked. Just once, but I saw it. A flicker of something. Maybe guilt. Maybe recognition. But it was gone so fast I could have convinced myself I imagined it. When Dad came back, she smiled at him like nothing had passed between us. Jason returned and offered her his hand, and she took it like it was scripted. They were back in character, and I was once again cast as the outsider, the misfit, the one still angry over things better left buried. But I didn't come to Easter lunch to make peace. I came because I needed to see their faces when I finally cracked the surface. Because I wasn't just angry anymore. I was curious. And if I was right about what I suspected, if even a sliver of what I remembered from that overheard conversation years ago was true, then Emily's perfect life wasn't built on a better set of choices. It was built on a lie big enough to break both of us. It was 2 days after Easter when I finally drove over to Dad's house again, not out of obligation or habit, but because something about the look he gave me after I made my little wine-soaked declaration had been gnawing at the base of my skull like a dull, invisible itch. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even embarrassment. It was fear, raw, flickering, and utterly out of place on a man like him, who had built his entire identity on quiet stoicism and practiced moral clarity. He was the kind of man who could walk through a funeral, a foreclosure, or a diagnosis without so much as a wrinkle in his voice. And yet, when I called him out for giving up on me, something shifted behind his eyes like a crack in glass just starting to spread. I wanted to see it again, to test the theory that maybe, just maybe, he had something to hide. The house looked the same as always, neat and lifeless, like a catalog display frozen in time. The porch still sagged slightly to the right. The flag in the front yard was still perfectly clipped to its pole, barely fluttering, and the doorbell still played that hollow, artificial chime that felt like it belonged in a nursing home more than a family house. Dad answered in his usual uniform, khakis, plaid shirt tucked in tight, and that old brown belt that looked like it had been through several wars. He didn't smile, just stepped aside to let me in, like I was a neighbor returning a borrowed rake instead of his daughter. We sat in the living room where everything looked staged, like it hadn't been touched since Mom died. The same beige carpet, the same couch with plastic still underneath the cushions, the coffee table that still held the fake crystal bowl of potpourri that had long since lost any scent. It wasn't a home anymore, not really. It was a shrine to a version of our family that never actually existed. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," he said eventually, after several minutes of clinking ice cubes in our respective glasses of tea. Sweet for him, unsweetened for me, a detail that somehow still managed to feel like a quiet insult. "I wasn't sure you wanted me to," I answered without looking at him. He didn't deny it. He just nodded, slow and deliberate, and took a sip of his tea like we were two strangers passing time at a bus stop. Then without preamble, I asked him, "Who's Richard?" I saw it instantly, that flinch he didn't quite mask, the way his lips pressed together like they were trying to keep something inside, and his fingers curled ever so slightly around his glass. It was the name he had let slip at the table, so fast and casual it almost got lost between the ham and the honeyed carrots. He had mentioned it like it was nothing, but I caught it, and I had remembered it. Because the only Richard I could recall from our childhood was the man who used to come by to fix the water heater, the one Mom would bake cookies for, even when he was just patching a pipe in the basement. I hadn't thought about him in over 20 years. Dad tried to recover. "Why do you ask?" "You said his name," I replied calmly, when Emily brought up the new nursery. "You said Richard always liked yellow, didn't he? And then you changed the subject. Fast. He set his glass down. That sound, glass hitting glass, felt louder than it should have in the stillness of the room. I don't remember that, he muttered. Bullshit. It came out flat, not angry, not performative, just factual, like stating the weather. And to my surprise, he didn't correct me, didn't scold me for my language like he would have when I was 15, and still naive enough to care what he thought about my tone. He sighed, leaned back in his chair, and stared up at the ceiling like it might write his excuses for him. Your mother knew Richard from before. Church, I think. Or maybe something to do with work. I never really asked. I didn't say anything. I just let him keep talking because I knew if I interrupted, he'd retreat behind the concrete wall of his silence again. He came around a lot. After we moved to this house, said he was helping with some repairs. Your mother always said he was a friend of the family, but I don't think she ever introduced him to anyone. Not properly. He paused, eyes still on the ceiling, and I could feel something heavy sinking into the room, thickening the air between us like fog. She changed after he stopped coming around, he added quietly. Got real quiet. Took naps in the middle of the day. Didn't laugh at the same shows. I thought it was just grief. Or maybe age. I didn't ask. I just kept going. I stared at him, waiting, but that was all he offered. No confession. No resolution. Just a few scraps of memory handed over like cheap receipts, barely readable, half faded. I found Mom's journal, I said then. That got his eyes off the ceiling. His face didn't twitch, but something behind his eyes went dark, like the lights had been dimmed. He didn't ask where I found it. He didn't ask what it said, which told me everything. There's a page I continued slowly, where she writes, Richard knew. He said if I told the girls, he'd ruin everything. I watched his face the whole time I spoke, and though he tried to stay blank, his mouth moved like he wanted to respond but couldn't find the words. His silence screamed louder than any argument. I leaned in then, elbows on knees, voice steady. What did she mean by that? He stood up, not quickly, not in a huff, just rose like a man who suddenly remembered there were 100 things he needed to do somewhere else. I don't think this is a good time for digging up the past, he said without turning around. And with that, he walked into the kitchen and left me sitting there, alone in the perfectly preserved mausoleum of a house that still bore my mother's ghost in every corner. But he'd answered me, maybe not out loud, maybe not with the courage truth demands, but guilt has its own language, and I was fluent. And now I had a name, a thread, and I was going to pull until the whole damn thing unraveled. The journal had been sitting in the back of my studio drawer for over a year, before I finally opened it again. Not because I was afraid of what it said, but because I already knew. I didn't need to reread the half-legible loops of my mother's handwriting to feel her presence, pressed between the pages like dried petals that once carried scent, meaning, and life. That little leather-bound book, the one with the tarnished clasp and the smell of dust and lavender, had been tucked away since I found it buried beneath a pile of Christmas decorations in the attic of the old house after Dad moved into his one-story retirement-safe beige ranch. I hadn't told Emily about it. I hadn't told anyone. Back then, it just felt like one more artifact of a woman who'd been quietly erased from her own family narrative. But now, after the Easter lunch and the strange shaky way Dad responded to the name Richard, I found myself flipping back through those pages as if they held a map. The entries weren't dated, not exactly, though there were scribbled references to seasons, holidays, moods. My mother never wrote full sentences, just fragments, observations, and emotional shorthand that seemed like it was meant only for herself. She referred to Emily and me as the little ones, or my girls, and rarely by name, as if even on paper she was trying to protect us from something she couldn't name. One entry, though, stood out like a jagged edge. He said I made a choice, but I didn't. I was given conditions. That's not choice. That's compliance dressed in guilt. Richard said the girls would be fine as long as I stayed quiet. That was the sentence that made my hand shake. Because for years I had believed that what happened to Mom, the slow withdrawal, the tears behind closed doors, the illness no one named, was just depression or grief or maybe resentment over the life she never got to live. But this was something else. This was a woman writing like she was under surveillance, like the walls had ears, and the journal itself might betray her. I remembered suddenly a dusty box I hadn't touched in years, one she had always kept locked in the top shelf of the bedroom closet. Back then, I'd been too young to think much of it. She called it Mom's important things and told us never to touch it. Emily never questioned that, but I did once. I asked what was in it, and Mom had smiled in that tired way she did when she didn't want to lie but couldn't tell the truth. Memories, she said, and that was the end of it. Now I couldn't get that box out of my head. The problem was, after she died, the house got sorted like a crime scene scrubbed for evidence. Dad packed things quickly, shoved what he wanted into storage, sold what he didn't, and donated the rest. But something in me said that box didn't end up in Goodwill. I tore through my storage unit first, digging through paint supplies, old canvases, boxes of bills and documents I hadn't looked at since my 20s. Nothing. But then I remembered. One summer, a few years after Mom died, Dad had dropped off a couple of boxes at my apartment, unceremoniously, as though he were doing a favor, rather than dumping responsibility. I'd never opened them. They sat in the back of my studio, marked in fading Sharpie, old papers, Carla. I opened the first box and found tax records, report cards, and some of Mom's recipe books. The second box was heavier. Inside was a velvet-lined jewelry case, some faded Polaroids, and under a pile of half-burned candles wrapped in tissue, the box. Small gray metal with a rusted latch and a stick-on label that read Keep. The key was gone. I had to pry it open with a screwdriver, careful not to damage what was inside. The metal gave with a reluctant creak, and I lifted the lid like it might explode. What I found wasn't what I expected. No letters, no money, just photographs, documents, and one birth certificate. At first, I didn't understand. The photos were of Mom, younger than I'd ever seen her, maybe 19 or 20, with a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, dark-haired, and smiling at her like he knew something no one else did. The same man appeared again in another photo, this time with his arm around her and a child in her lap. A toddler with dark curls. It wasn't me. It wasn't Emily. The birth certificate was older than mine by a few years. Issued in another state. The name listed under mother was my mother's. The name under father was left blank. And the child's name wasn't one I recognized. I sat there frozen, trying to stitch the threads together with fingers that had gone numb. Was this a half-sibling? Someone she'd had before she met Dad? Someone she gave up? Or was the truth more complicated, messier? I flipped one of the photos over. There was a message scribbled in faded ink. Don't let them tell you who you are. Love always, Ra. My stomach turned. R. Richard. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I stayed up reading and rereading the journal, trying to cross-reference details. In one section, Mom wrote about the night I was given the ultimatum and how they said the girls would never be safe if I didn't fall in line. What the hell had she been protecting us from? And who the hell was the child in the photo? Was it possible that Emily, pristine, perfect, adored Emily, wasn't my full sister at all? Was it possible she wasn't even Dad's daughter? I needed answers, and there was only one person who might have them. The next morning, I called Emily. When she answered, her voice was clipped and cold. But when I told her I'd found something of Mom's, something she needed to see, she agreed to meet. Her voice cracked just once, at the end of the call. A pause, a hitch, like a crack in a dam. And suddenly I knew. She already knew. She just hadn't thought I ever would. It was nearly midnight when my phone lit up, Emily's name glowing on the screen, like a warning flare I should have ignored. I was in bed, the photos and documents from the box still spread across the floor of my studio like a desecrated altar. the journal resting on the windowsill next to an untouched glass of wine. I had tried to sleep. I had turned off the lights, closed the curtains, even put on one of those old ambient soundtracks I used to listen to when I was recovering from my panic attacks after the divorce. But none of it helped. My brain was too loud, my hands too restless, and the weight of what I had discovered refused to settle into anything I could make sense of. When the call came in, I stared at it for a long time before answering, letting it ring almost to the end, half hoping she'd hang up before I had to hear whatever voice she had prepared for me. But she didn't hang up, and I pressed the green circle and lifted the phone to my ear without speaking. She didn't start with pleasantries. There was no soft entry, no sugarcoating, no attempt to dress the thing up like it was anything other than what it was. A raw nerve suddenly exposed to the air after decades of being buried. "I knew you'd find it eventually," she said, her voice low, like she was calling from a closet with the door barely cracked. There was a tiredness in her tone I hadn't heard since we were kids. The same exhaustion I once heard when she whispered to me through our shared bedroom wall, the night after Mom screamed at Dad behind a locked bathroom door. "You knew?" I asked, not bothering to pretend I didn't know what she was referring to. "You knew about the box?" "I knew about the box. I knew about the photos. I knew about the certificate." Silence fell between us then, thick and painful. I could hear her breathing on the other end, fast and shallow, like she was trying to keep herself from drowning. "I didn't know the whole story at first," she added after a long pause. "Not until I turned 18 and Dad brought me into his office and told me that if I ever asked questions, I'd be putting everyone at risk. He said Mom had made mistakes, that she'd invited danger into our lives, and that the only reason we were safe was because of the choices he made." I felt my throat tighten. It wasn't disbelief, not anymore, but a kind of sorrow that tasted like metal in the back of my mouth. I waited for her to keep talking because I could tell she had more, and once the dam cracked, there would be no stopping it. "He said Richard wasn't a good man, that he tried to claim something that wasn't his, that he used threats to get close to Mom again, and she made a deal to keep us out of it. But it didn't stop there. There was money involved. There were papers signed. I don't even know what kind. I just know that everything changed after Richard left town, and Mom never smiled the same way again." Emily's voice broke then, and I heard the unmistakable sound of her crying. Not the elegant kind of cry you can dab away with a tissue and a camera-ready sigh, but the ugly kind, the heaving, throat-choking kind, that pulls something out of you whether you want it gone or not. "I resented you for so long," she whispered. "You looked like her. You acted like her. You refused to let things go. And I hated it, Carla. I hated how you refused to play along while I was choking on the script. I stayed close to Dad because I thought that's what kept us safe. But I've been lying to myself for 20 years. I sat on the floor in the dark, gripping the phone so hard my knuckles ached, staring at the ceiling like it might offer answers I hadn't already dug out of the dirt. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask her why she never told me, why she let me twist in the wind, believing I was the broken one, the problem, the unstable daughter who couldn't just be normal for once. But all I said was Richard my father?" The pause that followed wasn't long, but it felt like it lasted a lifetime. "I don't know," she said, "and I think that's the point. I think Mom didn't either. Or maybe she did and just couldn't admit it, not out loud. And Dad, I think he made peace with that in the worst way possible." Another pause, but this one heavier. "There's more," she whispered. "But I can't say it, not over the phone, not yet." I heard the fear in her voice. And it wasn't about me. It wasn't about guilt or shame or regret. It was something deeper, something raw and terrified. And for the first time in years, I realized Emily wasn't just a liar wrapped in pearls and politeness. She was a prisoner too, just a better-dressed one. "I'm not trying to hurt you, Carla," she said. "But I can't protect you either. Not anymore." The line went dead before I could answer. I sat there for a long time after the call ended, the hum of the city beyond my window, doing nothing to muffle the silence that now sat in my chest like a stone. I picked up one of the photos from the floor, the one with Mom and Richard and the baby I still didn't know the truth about, and held it like it might warm my hands. But it didn't. It was cold. Everything was. Whatever happened all those years ago, whatever deal was made, whatever silence was purchased, it hadn't just buried the truth. It had poisoned everything that came after it. And now that the surface had cracked, I knew it wouldn't stop. I wasn't done. And neither was the past. It had been exactly 1 year since the last Easter, the one that cracked open the past like an overripe fruit, spilling everything rotten that had been preserved for decades under layers of silence, politeness, and carefully engineered family roles. The air was warmer this year, the spring arriving earlier than usual, and the streets of my neighborhood were lined with pink dogwoods and the golden dust of blooming pollen. I had cleaned my little studio from top to bottom the day before, not out of any particular need for order, but because it felt like something I should do before inviting people over, people who knew nothing about what had happened last year, people who hadn't grown up in a house with quiet punishments and louder silences, people who wouldn't ask me why there was no family at the table this time around. I hosted a small Easter dinner, just 6 of us, a few friends from the art collective, my friend Lena from the gallery, and Alex, who had become something steady and surprisingly quiet in my life. Not a rescuer, not a mirror, just someone who showed up and listened and didn't treat me like a project. We laughed. We drank wine that didn't taste like punishment. We shared stories about weird childhood Easters, burnt hams, and pastel dresses that felt like they belonged to someone else's body. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was pretending to belong to a family that didn't know what to do with me. But still, the empty chair at the end of the table sat there like a ghost. I didn't put a plate there. I didn't drape a coat over it to make it look used. I didn't explain it to anyone, but I noticed how a couple of them glanced at it now and then. The way people look at shadows out of the corner of their eye when they think no one's watching. That chair used to belong to Dad. Not the literal one, but the place, the role, the silent gravity he always held over every room he entered. After last year's confrontation and the weeks that followed, I had stopped calling, stopped visiting, and eventually stopped answering. He never reached out again. Emily said he wouldn't. She said he wouldn't know how to, even if he wanted to. That kind of man doesn't apologize. That kind of man doesn't unravel publicly. He just keeps living like the world never moved on, waiting for everyone else to fall back in line. But I didn't fall back. I never did. As for Emily, we hadn't spoken in months. After that phone call, we met once in a parking lot behind a church neither of us belonged to, sitting in her car like 2 strangers who once shared a childhood but no longer shared a language. She handed me an envelope. Inside were more letters. Ones she found in an old trunk of Mom's that Dad had kept locked in the basement. They were addressed to no one. Half were unfinished. The handwriting grew increasingly erratic near the end. In one of them, Mom wrote something that clung to the inside of my skull like wet cotton. I thought silence would be protection. I didn't realize silence is also inheritance. I asked Emily what she was going to do with the truth. She didn't answer. She looked out the window for a long time and said she didn't know what truth meant anymore. She had told Jason bits and pieces, enough to feel honest, not enough to burn everything down. She was still pregnant then, near the end, and she rubbed her belly like she was trying to transfer her guilt into someone who couldn't answer back. When I asked her if she'd ever tell the child, this new soul born into a family built on old cracks, she shook her head. Only if I have to, she said, and I remember thinking that was the most honest thing she'd ever said to me. We haven't spoken since, not because of hate, not even resentment, just space. Distance that made more sense than trying to pretend we could go back to something that never existed in the first place. I still don't know if we're half-sisters, or not sisters at all. I don't know if Richard was my father, or hers, or neither of ours. I don't know what Dad gave up to keep whatever arrangement he made, buried so deep it nearly swallowed all of us. I only know that something ended long before Mom died, and none of us were ever equipped to name it out loud. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, I sat alone at the table, staring at the empty chair and listening to the quiet hum of the street outside. The plates were still dirty, the candles had burned low, there was still half a bottle of wine left. I picked up the journal, Mom's journal, and opened to the last page. It was blank, except for one sentence she must have written on the day she decided she had nothing else left to protect. If you find this, don't rewrite me, just remember I tried. I read it 3 times before closing the book and placing it under the chair, not out of reverence, not as a symbol, just because I needed to put it somewhere that wasn't mine to carry anymore. There was nothing cathartic about it, no closure, no swell of music in my head, just a quiet kind of acceptance that not all truths get answers and not all families get resolution. Some people will say I should forgive, that I should call Dad, make peace before it's too late, that I should reach out to Emily, try to repair the bond, especially now that she has a child, a new life, a different story to tell. But the truth is, I don't know what peace would look like anymore. I only know that silence didn't protect us. It devoured us, and I refuse to pass that silence on. Some wounds don't close clean. Some families don't heal. Some stories end with more questions than answers. But sometimes, not always, not perfectly, the telling is enough. And if I've learned anything, it's that telling the truth, even when it breaks the room in half, is better than spending your life choking on the lie. Maybe that's the only inheritance worth keeping.